not seeing a difference in either the prilled urea or the neem-coated urea. And so the first one on top is anaerobic conditions, and this one on the bottom is, again, flooded conditions. But again, we're not seeing too much of a difference. Slightly higher again in the flooded, but nothing significant to talk about. So it seemed to suggest that whatever neem-coated urea was doing, it was acting on the nitrification process and led to the slow release. So why study it? In 2015, March actually, the government set about a policy suggesting that all urea that would be produced in the country was now going to be neem-coated urea. So they were going to completely move over to neem-coated urea. And the reason they did this is, as they pointed out about, because of divergence for industrial use. So until this point, the government subsidizes the production of urea specifically for agricultural purposes. And a lot of this was being diverted into plywood and paint industries, and obviously as a profit for the people producing the urea. So by switching over to neem-coated urea, the government is hoping to save 10,000 crore Indian rupees, which is about 1.5 billion USD, was their estimate by moving over. So it immediately became a much talked about conversation, obviously. And just quickly looking at the economics, the total price of urea, and the one on the right is looking at the USD. So the total price is about $200 of urea, and that would be calculated by looking at the manufacturing cost as well as like a slight profit markup for the companies. And the maximum retail price that it can be sold at is only $85. So the government is making up those subsidies. And just as a quick point, regular urea is about $5 different from neem-coated urea, so it's not a large price difference. But the government is subsidizing currently about $100. However, for industrial use, it's still sold at about $330 a ton. So obviously much larger than the $85 that farmers can buy it at. And so that price difference was what was causing this large divergence into industrial use, because producers could make a large profit off of it. Okay. So that's why the government started pushing neem-coated urea. But scientific studies had already been looking at some of the agronomic and environmental benefits of urea. So the ones that we're going to talk about today as basically, are we seeing consistent nitrification inhibition? Does it actually lead to yield improvements? And also, does it lead to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions? All of which are things that neem-coated urea has been purposed to do. Okay, so. And also, just briefly, the studies that I look at also talk about two other forms, which is Nimin urea and neem cake urea. And they're both derivatives of neem. Again, Nimin is more of a concentrated neem oil, which is basically neem oil treated to remove certain triglycerides and fatty acids. So it's slightly more concentrated, versus the neem cake is actually a byproduct of that oil processing. So it's generally powdered forms that are then mixed with urea. Yeah. So just looking at some of the literature, what you have is, I looked at 5 studies specifically that were looking at nitrifying inhibition. A lot of them is still being done in the lab, and we are seeing significant nitrification inhibition processes. The first study over here, Majumdar, I'll probably refer to again because they look at nitrification inhibition, yield, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So they look at a number of factors, and we'll probably come back to them. Sahavat, 1982, also does a lab incubation looking at nitrifying inhibition. And what they look at is just how much of, amount of nitrifying inhibition nitrifying inhibitor, neem, that actually has an effect. So they tried a couple of things, and they got an average of 25 to 37% of nitrifying inhibition. Another lab incubation by Kumar was looking at different concentrates of that neem oil, and they found that all those concentrates were having an effect, and it was ranging again from about 4 to 20% of inhibition. And again, so Reddy again looks at a lab incubation between two other native plants, and Suganya looks at it in the field. So again, you can see consistently that the field does show much lower rates as compared to lab incubation. but we are seeing effects from all these studies. And a study that I thought was very interesting is done pretty early again, 1986, where the author Santi looks at the population of nitrifying bacteria. So very specifically looking to see if it has an impact on the populations of Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter. And we can see initially, so this is for the Nitrosomonas, this is for the Nitrobacter populations, and this is their initial population density. And after 5 days, we can see that while it has increased in the soils that were treated with just urea, uncoated urea, all the extracts of neem have shown a huge drop in that population, and that goes on for about 30 days. So it's definitely having an impact on that population, even if it's not always seen very significantly in the field. So yeah, specifically at day 5, you can see that huge drop in populations. So this study by Muchandad actually compared neem urea to a number of other known nitrifying inhibitors, such as DCD or thiosulfate, and they also looked at Nimin, which was, like I said, a concentrated extract of that neem oil. And what they found was very, very little nitrifying inhibition properties through their field study, through over 95 days, and they looked at this in a rice wheat system. So over 95 days, again, initially, you do see some effect from all the NIs till about 50 days, and then there's basically no difference at all. And some of the conclusions that I came up with looking at these studies is, one, the concentration of the extract and the extraction technique, that is whether it's cold pressed or whether it's a solvent extraction, does have a significant effect, which was the range from 4 to 20%, so it can have a significant effect. Effects were more visible in coarse textured soils, sandy loam, as compared to finely textured soils. And also, again, inhibition is only seen for about 3 weeks after the fertilizer application, so this doesn't last for too long, or the entire growing season. As looking at the effects that neem-coated urea has on yields, almost every paper I looked at saw a positive increase in yield as compared to just uncoated urea. And there were 2 papers that did not see a significant yield difference, but none of those papers that I've seen have shown a reduction in yield. So at least one thing farmers can say is that adding this is not going to affect their soil, it's not going to affect their crops adversely, but could very likely lead to a positive yield increase. And this was a meta-analysis that was looking at, again, effects of these nitrifying inhibitors, as well as urease inhibitors and slow-release fertilizers on the yield difference. And crop yields over here, you can see neem, out of 9 studies and 22 observations, they definitely found at least 11 to 25% increase in yield over all those studies, and also an increase in plant nitrogen uptake. Yeah, perfect. So also an increase in plant nitrogen uptake. So finally getting on, the next thing I looked at was greenhouse gas studies, and that's not something that they're advertising to farmers very much, but it's something that a bunch of scientists are clearly very interested in. And again, because a lot of these are rice systems, so you do have a lot of methane production, you also have nitrous oxide emissions. And what we saw is in 5 out of the 6 studies, there was a decrease in the amount of emissions for nitrous oxide, and there was 1 study with no significant difference as compared to just adding a control urea. So just going over one of the studies, and this is the study that actually did show a significant difference, what you see is they measured these emissions over 95 days, and they had 2 sudden outbursts. One was right after an irrigation activity. One was on day 30, they actually added more fertilizer, so you see a big jump again. And so there is a large deal of variability in these emissions over time. And briefly just looking at the results, little checkered line, so the first arrow is just urea, and the second blue arrow, the lightly shaded bar, is neem-coated urea. And at this point, you're really not seeing much difference. In fact, neem-coated urea seems to be showing a slightly higher emission rate. But as we go further, and especially in the large jumps, we are seeing a small difference. It wasn't significant enough to show up in the statistics, but observationally, there did seem to be some slight difference. However, some of the other NIs have definitely shown significant differences, such as neem-encoded urea, which we can see in the next slide. So, neem-coated urea itself was not significantly different, however. But this was one study, and a bunch of the other studies do seem to be showing significant differences. And this one is Mala 2004, where they again look at neem oil-coated urea in the fourth line over here. And what they're seeing is that there was a significant difference, actually, quite a significant drop, from just adding urea. And they looked at both nitrous oxide and methane, and I'm going to get back to the methane, as well as the global greenhouse gas warming potential. So there wasn't too much difference when they finally calculated that warming potential, but between just the emissions, there was. Okay, so getting back to like methane, because if you're thinking about this, obviously nitrification inhibitors will affect rate of nitrification, but which would lead to a decrease in nitrous oxide. Why should it affect methane? And so plainly speaking, you have ammonium, you have organic carbon that's going to methane producers, and you're getting methane gas out of it that's being released, a lot of these from rice systems. But one of the potential possibilities that have been outlined is that this increase in ammonium that's there because the urea is not, because nitrogen isn't being sent back, isn't being broken down to nitrates, is a huge population growth of methanotrophs that could possibly be oxidizing methane. And this is still something that's being studied because there's not too much information out on there again, but it's just something that people have observed that it does often have an impact on methane production. So this was one possible suggestion that people have put across as a result as to why we were getting those results. Also, potentially, it was having an effect by the root rhizosphere, where it was increasing the population of methanotrophs there and leading to an increase in oxidation of that methane. Okay. So this is kind of wrapping up. We've seen that there's definitely a lot of effects that neem-coated urea seems to be having on greenhouse gas yield and nitrification rates. But there's also something that's been talked about a lot in India, and that's basically if farmers are overusing urea. And these are just a bunch of headlines from over the past couple of years, 2011 to 2015. So past 5 years, there's a lot of conversation happening on if there's an overuse of urea, mostly because of the government subsidies that make urea very cheap. So encourages farmers to just add a lot of urea and hope for better yields. There's really no incentive for farmers to want to have to reduce that urea or look for other management practices. And some of the effect that seems to be having is a decrease in something like a partial factor productivity, which basically looks at the yield of crops over the amount of fertilizer N applied. And India is, if we can see here, the green squares. And you can see that it's been steadily declining from 1985 to 2005. Which is when this data is taken. So what that basically is suggesting is, well, there isn't a significant decrease in yields that's been happening because people will be talking about that. So yields are staying the same, but fertilizer and nitrogen application has been going up, and that's been leading to that decrease in partial factor productivity. And we can see that too when we're looking at the nutrient balance, just looking at the nitrogen removal as opposed to the fertilizer nitrogen over the fertilizer nitrogen. So as a percent, you want to get that again as close to 100%. You add the fertilizer and you get all that nitrogen back. And again, we see there's a steady decline from about 65% down to 55%. 55%. So it has been going down over these years, suggesting that, yeah, farmers have been over-applying urea, which seems to be an impact of this, of the government subsidies. So I guess to sum up, what I'm going to end up with saying is all the benefits of neem-coated urea isn't going to be able to actually solve farmers' problems unless you look at it from a more holistic perspective. It definitely seems to do better in terms of just urea, and hopefully increases in yield will lead to farmers using maybe less of the neem-coated urea as opposed to urea, which is again something the government seems to be suggesting. But it's clearly not going to be enough to actually help out with India's soil problems by itself. And that's it. Thank you. And
I have like a two-part question.
Okay.
One is, how abundant is the neem tree? Is it grown in groves, or like are there neem farmers? And number two, what else is it used for? Is it used, is the oil have other purposes other than this?
The oil itself has some purposes, like it's sometimes sold as, like I said, an anti-pesticide. People will put it also to get rid of moths and just coat it with other things as to keep. Part of the reason it goes in the plywood industry is because if you coat wood with neem oil, it tends to like get broken down or like degraded less fast. But it's also used for medicinal purposes, so there's a great deal of medicine that's being looked at that's made out of neem. It's used in toothpaste. You can use the neem bark, the tree bark, to actually as a toothbrush kind of thing, because it's supposed to have medicinal properties. So for a lot of like home uses, it's going to be grown in villages and areas. But yeah, you do have a lot of you do have actual plantations that would be growing it, like not large plantations, but by the factories you'll have like plots of land and people growing trees specifically for neem oil production. Right. Is there a second part of that question?
No, that was both parts. Thank
Okay.
you.